So this paper is about trying to understand what are the macroeconomic effects of microfinance policies. We're going to get back to what we mean by them and a little bit of motivation. So by microfinance, I guess what is meant in the world or in developing countries is the idea of innovation that allow for small loans to be given to poor people. And these loans are mostly, I guess, in the narrative, it's mostly been primarily thought about loans, business loans, just to foster entrepreneurship, but also could be include loans for consumption smoothing, so helping people going through bad times, or it could also be thought about human capital loan for human capital investment. So in this paper, for the most part, we're going to be talking. Mostly we'll be talking about the first one, but it's a much broader, a larger endeavor. So one thing that makes microfinance seen as an important, as a very promising policy or innovation or development in developing countries is the fact that these loans were able, microfinance institutions were being able to give these loans with very low default rates. That was one of the things that made microfinance quite of a success. So on average, default rates are around 2-3%. And there have been a very large growth of microfinance. So for the last 10 to 15 years, microfinance has been growing at the rate of 20% per year. And not only that, there's been a large desire, especially in policy circles, to even expand and make microfinance much more broadly available in developing countries. I guess I'm not going to go into the data, but for a significant number of developing countries, microfinance amounts to, or microfinance loans amount to, say, close to 10% of GDP, and it's affecting over 10% of the population. So in some developing countries, microfinance is a very important part of these economies. Some other countries, it's not yet a large part of the economy, but there is clearly a strong interest in scaling this up. I mean, the drawback, so, and recently, the last, say, 3 to 4 years, there's been a large interest and work trying to evaluate these microfinance policies from the micro point of view, meaning by either looking at microdata or doing randomized experiments. But so far, we don't know much about what would be the economy-wide effect of microfinance. And that's the question that this paper is motivated by. So in this paper, as I was saying before, so we're going to think of microfinance as an exogenous innovation that will allow to guarantee a minimum amount of a loan for production purposes. And we're not going to be very explicit about where this innovation coming from, but we're going to take this as given, and they're going to try to understand the economic-wide implication of that. And for the most part, so we're going to be focusing on production loans. So we're going to be abstracting from consumption loans and so on and so forth. Although these might be, these are obviously interesting extension. We also, yeah, these loans will be. We're thinking of this innovation allowing for making loans with no default risk. This is sort of fairly, to first order, a good assumption to the extent that in the data, default risk is not very important. Although it might be that when you want to scale up microfinance to larger levels, you may want to be worried about this. But so far, the magnitude of microfinance in the data, this doesn't seem to be very important. Something will be important. We're going to be abstracting from intermediation costs. This will be something, they're going to be quite significant in the data. So microfinance been very successful at providing loans to the poor with low default rate, but it's quite costly to deliver these loans. So to some extent, we're going to talk about in this paper, we should be thought about some sort of upper bound on the gains from microfinance. Okay, so just as a preview, so and just to repeat first, what is the question we're going to be after? The question we're going to be after is trying to understand the general equilibrium impact of microfinance in development. Let me go through some of the answers. We're going to find that microfinance is going to be important in raising TFP, so the average productivity of these economies. At the same time, will be depressing capital accumulation quite significantly. So we're going to microfinance will lead to higher TFP, so total factor productivity of these economies, will depress capital accumulation quite significantly. The net effect will be that per capita income, so the average income in an economy where microfinance is going to be expanded to all the populations that want to take up, will be that have no effect on average income. Will increase wages. So it will not have an effect on per capita income, but will be affecting wages quite substantially. So that tell us that will lead to a very large redistribution from rich to poor. I guess from very productive entrepreneurs to marginal entrepreneurs or workers. They will have large welfare impact among the poor and marginal entrepreneurs. And so sort of the bottom line from the talk will be that all these effects I'm talking here, most of these effects will come through general equilibrium effects. Will not be direct effects that will happen. Will not be come out of the direct impact of microfinance. Actually, we're going to show you that most of these effects will come through the fact that prices in the economy, factor prices will be changing due to the policies. Yeah. In particular, especially the distributional impact will be mostly a general equilibrium impact. And this is going to be, in some sense, will be relevant. So one thing that we're going to do, we do in the paper, I'm going to go through in the presentation, is that we like to compare the effects in our model with the effects that people have found in microevaluations, so randomized experiments, so on and so forth. I'm going to show that the model will be consistent with the effects that we're going to see from the microevaluations, but actually, obviously, a microevaluation will miss the general equilibrium effects, and we're going to say that you're going to be losing a lot of the richness of the impact by doing that. So I guess in terms of a roadmap, forget about the second part. So not going to be much time, and so we hope.
I was in charge.
Yeah, but we're going to do first look at this part. So we're going to just present a benchmark model. We're going to spend quite a bit of time comparing the impact on the model in partial equilibrium with microevaluations, just to give us some sense of that the model, the impact effect on the model are going to be sensible. We're going to present general equilibrium impacts of microfinance in the model. Then we're going to discuss a little bit of distributional impacts, and then spend quite a bit of time comparing GE and partial equilibrium effects. So that's going to be it. Okay, so let me go through the model. Let me just preview a little bit where the ingredients will be in the model. The model will be heterogeneous agents, so individuals might differ in terms of how good entrepreneurs they could be, so how good the project that they could be running are, and in terms of their wealth. So some people might be wealthy, in which case microfinance might not be a big deal. Some other people might be poor, and that might be, for these people, microfinance might be a big deal. They will have an occupational choice. They could be workers and work for a wage, or they operate their own technology. And there will be a financial friction. So credits will not be perfect. In particular, we're going to be assuming that there will be a limit enforcement constraint. So people might be able to run away. So institutions might not be such that the people will have the incentive to repay all the loans. Therefore, in equilibrium, the amount of credit that an individual may have will be limited by these constraints. Okay, so let me just go into details about these different elements. So we're going to think about an entrepreneur as an individual being able to make some production. Think about individuals having the option of setting up a plant. Well, a plant could be a very small business, or could be a more sophisticated business. And by that, this plant technology will be summarized by a production function, where the amount of output or revenues an individual might be able to get will depend on their own ability. Let's call that Z. We have to supply their time to run this business. So we have to require a unit of entrepreneur's times. We require some capital, some machines, some working capital, some building to perform their business. I call that K. And they might also want to hire more labor. So you're going to have this sort of two types of labor, their own time plus some other labor input. And this will be a diminishing return to scale technologies. Therefore, yeah. So they will in principle be an optimal size of this business if they were not constrained by the capital input. Individuals the individual ability might be changing over time. So this CT will follow the following simple process. Testing out the ability in period S will either be the ability in the previous period, S minus 1, we say some probability gamma, or people might get new draws with probability 1 minus gamma, in which case this Z will be a draw from a Pareto distribution. So gamma will be, there are going to be two key parameters here. Gamma will be a measure of how persistent these shocks are. So if gamma is 1, means that a guy keeps the Z all its life. If gamma is 0, it means that a guy just get a new draw every period. Why this matters? Well, it matters for how important credit constraint will be. In a world where shocks are very persistent, eventually a guy will come up with will be able to self-finance their investment. So in a world where gamma is very large, then you do not expect credit markets to be very important. You think about the opportunities comes and go, then the guys might not have the right cash to implement the opportunities. So that's where gamma plays a role. And eta will tell you something about how dispersed these business opportunities get to be. A world with eta is very high, productivities are very concentrated, so there's not much that is lost by not having the right guy doing the business. You may have a loss because some guys might have too much capital versus others with too little capital. So that's low, but there's not a loss in misallocation across different Z's. Okay, just in terms of continuing with the model. Let me just go through the timing. How does the decisions an agent phase each period look like? Think about a period, an agent being described by two numbers, A and Z. A will be his own wealth. Z will be his productivity at the beginning of the period. So there's going to be a basic decision that an individual will take every period. Will be whether to operate a technology, to just run a business, or to be a worker. If he's an entrepreneur, he has to decide how much capital and labor to invest. If he's a worker, just supplies the labor to the market. After that, he decides to just produce and consumes. And at the end of the period, his shock ability might change, may remain to be the same with probability gamma, or change with probability 1 minus gamma. We can assume that at the end, after production takes place, individuals might be able to default. So we can assume that individuals might be able to invest their wealth, or may get more credit to invest beyond their own wealth. So the difference between K and A, when I think about borrowing. And at the end of the period, individuals might be able to default. We might repay the debts or default. And these default options will limit the amount of borrowing that will take place at the beginning of the period. So that's kind of the basic timeline within a period. And then over time, this period gets repeated indefinitely. So let me just say the same thing with more equations. The problem of a worker, so the problems of individual that is at this point, is going to be fairly simple. We just decide how much to consume and how much assets to take to the following period to maximize the present discount value, expected present discount value of the utility subject to a period-by-period budget constraints. So the consumption plus the amount of wealth to take to the following period has to be equal to their income, both their labor income, W, or the amount of capital income he has from the wealth that he started the period with. And here, individuals, in the future, they might decide to be entrepreneurs, even though today they're not entrepreneurs. And that might happen because currently they might not have enough wealth, so they may decide to save up and maybe enter in the future, or maybe just the fact that if they happen to come up with a good opportunity in the future, they might decide to enter. Yeah, the program of entrepreneurs is slightly it's sort of similar, with only different that now we're gonna have. Well, and one thing here is we're abstracting from consumption loans, so that appears in the fact that we are not allowing A to be negative. So we're just shutting that down altogether. For the case of an entrepreneur, have a similar problem but now their income is a little bit different. So his income is not his wages, but it's not going to be his profits as an entrepreneur. So we have the revenues minus the capital, the factor payments to capital, the factor payments to labor. He has his own capital income. So the way we're doing it now is we're assuming the way we decentralize the borrowing in this model is we are assuming that the entrepreneurs rent the capital within a period, and the credit constraint will be a rental limit. That's going to just describe in a second. So I guess we're assuming that the capital is not owned by the entrepreneur, but the entrepreneur rents the capital and has his wealth in a banking account. Alternative decentralization will be one where the entrepreneur owns the capital and issue debt. Those two are going to be equivalent, subject to the fact that we need to be careful about the timing of the shock and when the shock is known. On top of this constraint, an entrepreneur will have a limit enforcement constraint. So this is a constraint that will tell you that it has to be the amount of capital the entrepreneur uses has to be such that he has an incentive to repay, like in this case, the rental contract down to default. And here, upon default, we're assuming that an entrepreneur gets to keep a fraction 1 minus fee of the revenues net of the labor payments. So the entrepreneur has to pay the labor contract, but may decide not to pay the rental contract, and actually may run away with the capital rented. That's similar to having a decentralization with the entrepreneur owns the capital, but he can run away with the capital and not pay the debt. So, and this is going to be equivalent to have a constraint that tells us that there's going to be a limit. The limited community constraint gives you a limit on the amount of capital an entrepreneur can rent as a function of his own wealth, his ability, and the enforcement of contract. Where this fee measures how much enforcement there is. If fee is close to 1, means that entrepreneurs get nothing if he does not repay the rental contract. Therefore, he will repay the rental contract to the extent that he's productive. If fee is close to 0, means that he always will never repay a rental contract. So the only amount of capital investment that he could do is basically A. So there's going to be two extreme cases. Things in between will be cases where there is some borrowing or some external finance beyond the initial resources. So I guess let me just illustrate the rental limit. So this is going to be a figure where I'm showing you the wealth of an entrepreneur and on the x-axis, and the capital invested, or the amount of capital he could invest on the y-axis. And I'm normalizing the two things by the wage. So think about this as wealth relative to a yearly wages. So number 3 means this is an individual whose wealth at the beginning of the period amounts to 3 years, three times his yearly wages. So from here, you need just to read that there will be an increase in the amount of capital an entrepreneur will be able to invest will be an increasing function of the wealth. So this will look like a collateral constraint type of thing. And that the more productive an entrepreneur is, the more he will be able to invest. So the blue line will be the capital invest that entrepreneur will be able to invest if he were to have the highest shock in a parameterization I'm going to show you later on. So in terms of just illustrating a little bit how the models work, it's interesting to look at the occupational choice, how the occupational choice depends on ability and wealth. So in a world with no credit, no limited enforcement of perfect credit markets, it's going to be true that there will be a vertical line that will be dividing individuals into those that has low Z, low entrepreneurial ability, will be workers, and high Z, high entrepreneurial ability will be entrepreneurs. In a world with imperfect credit markets, what will be true is both ability and wealth will matter for occupational decisions. So it will be a region of high ability but poor individuals that will decide to be workers. We're not going to be sufficiently capitalized. On top of that, we're going to have that for a given ability, those with limited wealth, they might be entrepreneurs, but will be constrained, meaning the amount of capital that will be invested in their business will be less than the efficient amount, while if you get to be very productive, very wealthy, you'll be unconstrained independently of credit markets. And just as an illustration, these are from the 3 figures I've showed you before. These are 3 ability types. This is going to be the highest ability types in our simulations. Going to be the top 1 percentile, top 5, top 10. It's going to be interesting because microfinance will be, that's going to be the region where microfinance will be operating. That's going to be clear later. And just as a last piece of illustration, is in the model, the evolution of wealth will be a function of the ability of individuals. So different individuals with different abilities will have different incentive to save because they will be facing this different return on their savings. And also individuals might the dynamics of the individual's wealth will be a function of where do they start from. So here is there are 4 paths of the amount of capital invested in their businesses for individuals with different ability levels to start with, and then we're keeping their ability level over time. For guys that start with 0 wealth to start with. So these are guys that have no personal resources. So I guess it's this guy here is the most productive guy in our simulation. This is a guy that whose capital investment will skyrocket very fast. So his own funds are growing very, very fast. Top 1 percentile is 2. The top 5 percentile is also going to be growing his investment, but he's going to be doing that at a very slow pace. Here, this dotted line is his optimal capital investment. And here, guys, the 10 percentile is a guy that if he starts poor, he just remains poor. This guy will be, you can call it in a poverty trap. So it's a guy that it's not going to be an entrepreneur, and his capital investment will be always 0 if you start with 0 wealth. On the right-hand side, you're just doing the same for a guy, but we're going to study the guy with a significant amount of wealth. Actually, this is wealth level that put him in the top 5 percentile of the wealth distribution. So I guess for this most productive guy, things look almost the same. The same for the top 1 percentile. Not quite, could look quite different for the top 5 percentile, and even more for the top 10 percentiles. Here, the top 10 percentiles will remain an entrepreneur, will be an entrepreneur, remain an entrepreneur in the long run, if he had started with being very wealthy. So microfinance will be, we're going to show you in a second, operate in these 2 guys. But this also already gives you some sense that it might not do much in wealth retain for the top ability guy. You can already see that. Okay, so let me just finish describing the model, and then we're just going to show results. But just telling you how do we implement microfinance in our model economy. So we're going to take, as I said before, we're going to take microfinance as technology. We'll take it as exogenous, but will be this innovation that allows relax the limit commitment constraint for a small amount of loans, effectively guaranteeing a minimum amount of loans for production, have no default risk, and there will be no intermediation costs. So in terms of the math, we're going to change the rental limit. So without microfinance, amount of capital an individual could invest will be some function of his wealth, Z, and phi. We're going to change from this constraint to the following constraint. So the following constraint, what it does is give access to everybody of a minimum size of a loan, BMF. So that's going to be a number that we're going to be changing. We're going to be changing. Yeah, so that's going to be a parameter on the model that will be changing. So this amount, this is a loan that needs to be repaid. So you're going to be facing the same interest rate as whatever external finance you get from the market. So you're going to have the same interest rate, but it's going to be from some people, this A plus BMF will be bigger than the amount of money they could get from the market. In this sense, these guys will be using microfinance. So you're going to be changing the rental limit from this one that look here to something like this. So you're going to be allowing, so in some sense, you're going to get this vertical distance from the 45-degree line that is your wealth. And some people, that will be better than the amount they can get into the market. In this example, for the blue guy, that's just irrelevant. But it's going to be relevant for guys that are poor among these two other groups. But I guess, yeah, in this example, it's relevant for him. So in terms of occupational choice, we're going to be doing is we're going to get some of these guys in extensive margin. Some of the guys that were not entrepreneurs because they were not wealthy enough, they might be becoming entrepreneurs right away. Although we saw that these guys were crossing this threshold very quickly, so how important that will be depends on how the dynamics of wealth look like. Okay. Yeah, we can do it furthermore. So okay, just to summarize, I guess I can just keep this. So yeah. So this is not a model we can solve by hand or characterize analytically. But what I'm going to do is we're going to put parameter values. We're going to choose parameter values for the model and present results for different counterfactors, so different microfinance policies. So the way we're going to do that is, so one good thing is that, I guess, it's good and bad. So we choose a very simple parameterization of the model. So they're going to be, in some sense, 5 or 6 parameter values you need to think about. There are going to be 2 parameter values determining the process of ability. There are going to be 2 parameter values for technologies, and there are going to be parameter values for limit commitment constraints. So what we're going to do is we're going to use data from both developed and developing countries to try to inform these values. I guess so. I mean, I'm not going to get into the calibration very much, but just to give a sense, we're going to be targeting things like size distribution of establishment in India and the US. We're going to look at things like income inequality measures that might tell us something about what is the share of income that entrepreneurs get to have, if they, since they happen to be in the top incomes in the data and in the model, and looking at moments on the exit rate of business that may tell us something about how fast or how persistent this business project get to be. And also going to match data on external finance to GDP, say in India, to get some benchmark of how much credit do we get to observe in a poor country where microfinance tend to be implemented. So how constrained happen to be business in poor countries? That will come from some information how much external finance to GDP data they get to be. And then we're going to be evaluating the model by asking the question, well, how much do the equilibrium change as we change BMF, the amount of minimum amount of a loan that we guarantee. I'm going to do that by looking at steady state, but also looking at transitions to calculate welfare impact. Okay, so having that said, let me skip the following figure, except for the fact that there will be a few parameters you need to pin down, and there will be a bunch of moments. Okay, so I want to just instead of going through the calibration, let me just tell you something about how does the effects in our model compare with the things that people have found in the field. So when I do in the paper, I just go to two of the first micro evaluations of microfinance, and just take them as being small interventions, so that we're only going to pick up partial cumulative effects, and do those interventions in our model with fixed prices, and see what do they get. These two interventions, one is a randomized experiment in India, Hyderabad, by Banerjee et al. One is an evaluation of a very large you can think of micro-lending policy at the village level in Thailand by Joe and Rob Townsend. I'm going to simulate similar size interventions and compare our short-run partial effects with theirs. I'm going to show you the bottom line is you're going to see that a lot of the things that appear in these micro evaluations are actually kind of being highlighted by this literature, going to be natural things that happen in our model. I'm going to also find that the magnitude of the impact is going to be reasonably well. I mean, we're similar. So this is one of the things that. So I guess first I need to tell you. So I guess my 2 minutes summary of the my bias summary of the micro evidence, so Rob and Joe can get more into it, is that one thing that the micro literature found emphasizes take-up rates are quite low. So this microfinance is not something that is affected. So we offer loans in villages and slums in developing countries. We expect to change the life of the poor, and what we find is very few people are taking up these loans. So that's kind of a path forward. It was a puzzle. And also but the impact is very heterogeneous. So if you look at people that happen to be more likely to be entrepreneurs, those are going to be taking up the loans. So you're going to be, and then the income in consumption is also very interesting. You expect that you give loans to people, they will be increasing the consumption. But then what you find a lot is people decrease the consumption, increase their savings. Why? Well, and these studies document some of this, is people are going to, if they have to be a fixed type of investment, by giving a loan, then we may be moving people away from call it a poverty trap, make them save more to leverage this borrowing, and actually making this fixed investment. So these are two things that I'm going to show. Yeah, so this in terms of, this is going to be 2 figures. So this figure here will be, in the x-axis, you're going to have ability percentiles. So individuals, I get the Z, just in terms of in numbers, I put just in terms of which percentiles of the ability distribution they correspond to. And these are take-up rate of microfinance. So in terms of the fraction of people that use microfinance. And this in the model, and this is the amount of, how large is microfinance as a function of total external finance. So you see, in the model, it's infinite. No, in the model with microfinance, or in the model without microfinance, sorry.
In reality, if I offer microfinance loan, somebody takes it up and just buys a TV.
I guess
What's the problem?
yeah, the problem is that if this is a joint liability group, the people.
But some of the new microfinance programs are not even joint liability.
Yeah, so I guess I don't know. So in principle, I guess in the original type of, I guess.
Yeah, you need to turn the mic on. Since everything is being filmed, it's when someone's listening to the film and they come to the part where nobody can hear anything, it just turns off. But everything you said is lost if it's not on that film.
Okay.
Many, many more people will see the film than will hear it in the room. So it's very important that you do that.
Okay. Okay. So I kind of understand why those who repay, because they might have productive opportunities and they want to keep a reputation. I've got no problem with that. I'm just trying to understand why the take-up would be low if the cost of default, you're just taking a one-off loan and then never take it again anyway, because you've got no use for it. You just repair the roof or buy a TV or something and then default.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer to
Okay.
I don't have an answer for
Yeah.
that, except that empirically it's not too high. We do see high repayment. There's models of information where we're agnostic about sort of where this technology comes from. But if it comes from either improved information or improved enforcement, somehow the microfinance companies are able to prevent that.
But I guess we're not going to be doing any of that. So I guess that's more on, I guess we don't provide an answer to that. Sorry. Okay, so, but.
And I understand that. And I
Yeah.
also understand why the repayments are high, given that those who repay have high ability and hence good investment opportunities. What I don't understand
Why they
is
don't
why
take
the
up.
left tail doesn't take up if it's got an opportunity to default effectively costlessly.
Yeah, but it has to be
That's-
that it has to be that there is something in the technology of microfinance that make enforcement working. I mean, at least that was true with joint liability. So the extent that it's not joint liability, then it's harder to understand. I agree. But in terms of the more traditional ones, this rationale early on was joint liability, and that was our interpretation here. So two things to say. Take up rate here will happen at the very high end of ability distribution. That's kind of alike with the micro literature. Another thing that in the model happened naturally is that you look at consumption, how consumption is affected by microfinance, and what you see is consumption going to drop quite significantly. For which guys? Well, actually, these are the guys. It was kind of the 10 percentile guy that I showed you at the beginning. It's the guy that was just in a corner without microfinance. With microfinance, decided to start investing, saving to leverage the investment. And for the higher ability guys that were not in a corner, you will see more standard impact. In terms of the magnitude, here we just show you. So in the model, we make a microfinance intervention that's kind of similar to the ones in the data in India and Thailand. So the maximum amount of the loan relative to per capita consumption is of the order of one. So it means you can get at most a loan of the size of 1 year of consumption. The amount of in this economy, credit amounts to 10% of per capita consumption. What you see is in the model, what you're going to see is in Project T, you're going to get large impact in entrepreneurship of the order of 3 percentage points. It's a little bit larger in India and Thailand, but it's fairly the same order of magnitude. We're going to have large income of investment and a small impact on consumption. I guess what is the difference between these two columns and this one is in the data, a lot of microfinance is used, significant amount is used for consumption purposes. We're not allowing for that. But the bottom line is we get a similar effect. Okay, so we're going to just do next is just telling you what do you get when you take into account genetic effects. What you get is microfinance is not a randomized experiment in a village, but it's something that now you allow the whole economy to have access to these loans of a small size. This is not of access to any loan, but just a loan of a small size that any guy could use it, provided they're kind of forced to repay. So not everybody will be using it to buy a TV. Okay, so that's kind of the first one. This is going to be the impact on output, TFP, and capital accumulation. This is going to be different sizes of microfinance. So one will be when the max loans is one times yearly wages, 2 times, say up to 5 times. So you see it's going to have a large impact on TFP. So TFP will increase by, if you make microfinance loans to be as large as 5 times annual wages, you're going to get TFP increased by a little more than 10% percent. On the contrary, you're going to get capital accumulation, so to drop quite significantly by a little bit more than 20%. So you put the two things together, per capita income increase by less than 4%. On the other hand, wages increase quite a lot. So your per capita average income increased by less than 5%, but wages increased by closer to 20%. And interest rate will be increasing quite a bit. So that's kind of the first, in terms of aggregate impact, effect that you get. So let me just a little bit just clarify where this is coming from. So what is going to be important is that wages increase very high. So wages will increase is principally for two reasons. On the one hand, entrepreneurs get to be more capitalized, they maybe demand more labor, so the labor demand shifts to the right. So that kind of maybe increase wage rate. On the other hand, also having this extensive margin effects. So people that were workers, now margin entrepreneurs get to be access to microfinance, so they may be dropping for labor supply. So the labor supply drops. So just to get an idea of that, so this is going to be the effect on the aggregate, what would have happened if we don't allow any changes in occupational choice. So let's take the amount of the entrepreneurs that happen to be entrepreneurs at the beginning, and let's just force them to be the only entrepreneurs in the model. What you're going to have that you're going to have almost no impact on wages. So let's tell you that most of the impact on wages in the model come from this extensive margin of people dropping out from the labor supply. So a few things I want to do. So just to trying to provide a little bit of intuition very briefly on why TFP increases and why capital accumulation goes down. TFP will be increasing mostly, so TFP could be increasing for two reasons. Could be increasing because we get better guys to be entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth, or could be increasing because entrepreneurs get to be more capitalized. Tend out to be that most of the impact has to do with entrepreneurs being more capitalized. So you're mostly affecting guys that are entrepreneurs. They're going to be having more closer to the desired capital investment. You don't affect that much the ability margin because on the one hand you get some good entrepreneurs, on the other hand you get more margin entrepreneurs. So you end up getting, yeah. So that kind of goes against that. Then why capital falls? Well, capital accumulation falls because for the same reason. So because of the redistributive impact of microfinance. So microfinance end up being increasing wages, particularly increasing the income of workers and margin entrepreneurs. So that's kind of shifting income from high ability guys to marginal ability or low ability guys. High ability guys in the model, as in the data, have very high saving rates. So the net effect of that is you making decreasing the saving rates in the economy. Let me just get a little bit into that. So the saving rate in the economy, you can think of being an income weighted average of the saving rate of, say, high ability and low ability guys, to make the example simple. Microfinance will have not much of an effect on saving rate, but mostly will have an effect on relative incomes. And that will be declining the income share of high ability guys. So you're going to have a declining capital accumulation because you're going to be redistributing income from high saving to low saving guys. Just to conclude, let me to show two more things. Microfinance has we're going to have large welfare impact, I guess, across ability groups. So this is the effects, the welfare gains of microfinance for different guys in the ability distribution, averaging over the wealth, and different guys in the wealth distribution, averaging over the abilities. Then of the wealth, it will be mostly the guys will gaining will be the poorest, low ability guys. Actually, the higher low wealth guys, high wealth guys going to lose to some extent. And in terms of abilities, it's going to be affecting the low ability guys, but particularly so will be affecting the marginal entrepreneurs the most. And that's kind of something that the empirical literature have focused on a lot. So just to, I guess now for sure to conclude, so in terms of what do you get from general equilibrium as opposed to partial equilibrium? For example, in terms of welfare gains, you get a lot. So the dotted lines, what will be the welfare implication of microfinance is you don't take into account general economic effects. When we use these, you will see, well, we have no effects on the low ability guys, because the only reason why they will be affected are if they become entrepreneurs. These are not going to become, most likely, not going to become entrepreneurs. So all this difference between the blue and the red line is G effects on wages, and we have a much more larger impact on the high ability guys. In terms of wealth, it's much more striking. So in the general economic effects at the blue line, the dotted line is much more muted. In terms of the aggregate, in partial equilibrium, you're going to grossly overestimate the impact. So these are G effects I showed you at the beginning. This is going to be the partial equilibrium impact. Yeah.
All right, thanks for the opportunity to discuss this paper. It is a very sexy paper because microfinance is very sexy. All right, so the United Nations declared the year 2005 to be the year of microcredit. 2006, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded for microcredit. Bill Gates is putting up a whole bunch of his own money to kind of fund more microcredit around the world. So looking at microcredit is pretty sexy. He's not? Well, he's putting up somebody else's money.
No.
No? Well, whatever. There's money going into microcredit.
Everybody but Bill Gates.
Anyway. Very good.
That's true.
So obviously, microfinance, okay. So obviously what we would like to know is, given that there's such an emphasis on expanding these programs, in part because of a belief that they're an effective tool for fighting poverty, and at least amongst some people, partly also from the belief that this might contribute to solving aggregate development problems. What we'd like to know is there any chance that that's true? Is this potentially another silver bullet that might be fired at development, and if so, just how powerful a bullet? And perhaps more importantly, if we expand microcredit and microfinance, is it possible that in doing so, this will give rise to general equilibrium effects that will either strengthen or weaken the effects that it's been shown to have on poverty, at least at a micro level? So to answer those questions, what the authors do is they come up with a laboratory, they write down a model, and they conduct precisely that experiment with that in mind. And it's important to stress at the outset that the answer is not obvious at all. In slightly different models, people have come up with examples in which expanding microcredit could actually reduce welfare, potentially by reducing wages for the poor people. So it could actually have been bad for poverty, and likewise, it's not obvious that this should have a very big aggregate effect. Now, of course, what you've just seen, you might take away as evidence of saying, in fact, some of those fears are misplaced. If anything, expanding microcredit, if you believe the numbers that have been put into the model, is actually likely to be an even more powerful poverty-fighting tool than it would be on a small scale. Right? So if we believe the numbers that come out of the model, the increase in wages that results are going to increase the welfare of all of those people who are very unlikely to ever participate in these entrepreneurial programs, and that's going to increase their welfare substantially. For the kind of numbers that we thought that are kind of plausible, say on the order of a 2 times annual wage amount that you can actually borrow through these microcredit facilities, we'd go from being a 2% wage increase, 2% lifetime consumption equivalent measure of welfare increase under partial equilibrium, to perhaps an 8% increase, a 4-fold increase as a result of these general equilibrium effects. So these general equilibrium effects are very powerful affecting poverty. Now, what you might have done is come away and with the belief that, in fact, it'll have almost no effect on aggregate. And indeed, as far as output goes, this picture shows it has very little effect on aggregate output. But of course, what we care about is not output per se, what we care about is welfare. And relative to output, what we want to know is how much output you get for the cost of providing the inputs to produce it. And what this shows is that you actually provide a lot less capital, and TFP goes up. TFP in aggregate goes up 4%. Now that's a small amount when we're trying to close a massive difference in TFP levels across countries. But a 4% increase in TFP is nothing to be sneezed at compared to the kind of estimates we get out of other exercises designed to improve the allocation of resources. A 4% number is a pretty big one. Now, of course, that begs the question, should we take the numbers as given? Is there any reason to believe the numbers are overstated or understated? Is there anything about the model that might be biasing the results? What I'll do is I'll throw out a couple of possibilities, then we'll open it up for discussion. So one thing that the authors were very upfront and honest about is that the way, and this has come up in the discussion a little bit too, is that the way they're modeling microcredit is it's this technology that allows you to borrow without any risk of default, and it's costless to provide. There's no cost in terms of intermediation, and there's no cost of enforcement. Now, obviously, there's got to be some cost, and that means that the numbers in the context of the model that we're talking about must be viewed as somewhat of an upper bound. But how loose an upper bound is it? Well, one thing that people often point to as far as enforcement of this microcredit is that you often have kind of group and social pressure to honour your loans. And so this kind of gets at what the costs of default are. And a lot of critics of these programs have argued that the social cost, the costs of ostracism, my kids won't play with your kids, I'm not going to invite you over for cocktails or whatever, may actually be quite significant. And some of the big critics have seized on a couple of isolated cases where participants in these programs have committed suicide, arguably because the social pressure to repay was too much for them. Now, to what extent that's more general, I don't know, but it is a cost that has to be subtracted from these things. What about things that might understate the benefits? Well, it's easy to think of a lot, and the authors were upfront about several. There's no room for smoothing consumption here and using these loans to smooth consumption. And in the face of something like a health shock, that could be very important. Although the general equilibrium effects there are a little bit more subtle because that kind of loan for consumption insurance would also decrease motives of precautionary saving that would have aggregate implications as well. Likewise, there's no role for these loans to support human capital accumulation. And I think many of the people who believe that microcredit might be a silver bullet for development have some kind of an idea of a virtuous cycle in mind where this credit is going to allow people to educate themselves and therefore this will expand into having much larger effects. Well, that's all absent here. In addition, and this is, I think, important in the light of the early examples of microcredit, there's no role for microcredit to interact with the hiring of other factors of production or is there any sense in which it affects the kind of competition in credit markets? So what do I mean by that? And I'll end on these notes. The kind of early anecdotes about the formation of microcredit were about going into a village where there are a small group of women who are buying bamboo and turning them into bamboo stools. Right? And the problems they faced were that they didn't have the money to buy the bamboo, and so they were really left with two alternatives. They could borrow from a moneylender who was charging between 10% interest a day and 10% per week, a very high rate of interest, or they could engage in some kind of trade credit where they would borrow the bamboo from the owner of the bamboo and then would give the proceeds back and keep a small amount of the change. Now, I cite that for two reasons. Firstly, I think that's very persuasive evidence that there's strong market segmentation in credit, and that one of the primary benefits of making microcredit more available is that it actually increases competition in the market for credit and reduces the ability of these moneylenders to extract extortionate interest rates. That's something that's completely absent from the model and arguably would lead to much bigger effects if it was allowed for. Secondly, in the example of those women, they were using this money to buy inputs. In other words, they were borrowing for working capital purposes. Now, if we expanded the microcredit and allow that to be used for purchase of labour or intermediate inputs in a model like this, arguably it would have much larger effects. Much larger because the output elasticity of these other factors of production is much larger than the output elasticity of capital, and hence distorting that margin has a much bigger effect on output. So there are just a couple of ideas. I'll stop it there. Let's open it up for discussion.
I have a question about the estimate that investment goes, or capital goes down, because you show that saving goes up, and that output goes up, which would I would assume when if distribution didn't change, that would lead to more saving, and then you show that the people who got micro loans were saving a lot more, and so I wonder why would that? How confident are you in your estimates of what the saving rate is for higher income people and lower income people, and the source of the micro loan capital that would necessarily cause the total capital in the group to go down.
So the saving rate that goes up is of the marginal entrepreneurs.
You need a mic.
Oh, I never turn it off, so I have one. Yeah, sorry. No, so the saving rate that goes up is the marginal entrepreneurs, and those account for a very small part of aggregate savings. A large part of aggregate savings is accounted by say, by top 5 percentile of abilities. So one has to be very careful that aggregate quantities are very much driven by the tail of abilities, at least in this model, but also in the data to some extent. So even though saving rate of the marginal guys goes up, goes say from some negative number to some positive number, the saving rate of the top ability guys is not that much unchanged. What change a lot is the income share of the say the top 5 percentile of abilities related to the bottom 95.
It's the income of the high income people go down. Their share goes down, but output goes up.
And output goes up mostly goes up because TFP is going down, because the location of resources get to be improved in the model. So
No, I mean, no, but output's basically flat, right? That was, that's the blue line there.
The
Right?
blue line is sort of increased by say 2 to 4 percentiles. TFP increased by 14, and
One of the extensions that we did, at some point you mentioned where the source of this microfinance is coming from. Is that what was I correct? So we do an extension where we think of, you might think what's happening here is this is all due to microfinanced entrepreneurs and other entrepreneurs competing for the same capital. So we did an extension where you have a small open economy. So the supply of capital is completely elastic. It's not, so you get a very similar result. What matters here in a world of financial frictions is the amount that you're saving, because savings is used as collateral. And so the source of where the capital is coming from is less important than the savings that people hold.
So you want to answer to
What's that?
to Mark?
Oh, I was thanks, a good discussion. I thought of two things. One is the competition, and I guess maybe this relates to Costas's. Again, we're agnostic as to where this kind of advantage of microfinance comes from. But if you think it comes from some sort of a market power where a microfinancer is coming in and is able to offer, dynamic contracts, then actually the competition, this is kind of orthogonal to our model, but then you might think that the competition would actually undermine the technology itself, which is as you have more and more microfinance, you don't have the market power to offer these dynamic contracts. Or if what's happening is there's, Rocky Balboa is, threatening to break your limb if you don't repay, that gets undermined too.
So I was a bit confused by the nature of the experiments you did. When you go, say, from the US to India, you change a number of things when you go from, say, one economy to the other one. So those numbers actually reflect, among other things, the changes in the underlying distribution of the underlying distribution of entrepreneurial abilities and so on. Mm-hmm. So it might be interesting to know how all this process interplays with all the distortions that we know are in place in countries like India that affect size.
So partially trying to capture some of that, we first did the model calibrating all to the US so that the distribution of productivities and everything was the same. And there you're going to get much larger effects. And then we say, well, let's try to introduce one interpretation of why the distribution of abilities, effective abilities, will be different is because, well, maybe there are these other distortions. So that's our rationale of recalibrating distribution of Z's to in India is to say, well, that's a cheap way to get that, and when you get it in India you get a much significantly less dispersion in productivities. So I guess our answer would be the way they interact is they make microfinance less important, because if
the question is how much.
I don't remember. It affects on the think about maybe 15 to 10%. Instead of being 15%, think about 10%, like 1/3 less. But that's from remembering some early exercises we did.